in a small degree, as you achieve more self-sufficiency, you're gaining liberty for your family and you're putting options on the table when and if the tyrants come knocking.
Yes, I've got a graph here, which I wish I could share. You've probably seen it already. I think you have a very similar graph in your book. It's a figure of family economies of US couples aged 1864 from 1800 to 2010. And just as you say, 80% plus in 1800 were within what they call corporate families, the clan-based economic unit, e.g. a family farm or a family store where the whole family works there. Then we see the second largest share is the male breadwinner, which would be more typical in towns and cities. And that segment grows through the 19th century to its peak in about the 40s, where that is about 60% of the population. And another segment grows rapidly at that point, the dual earner household, which today is the largest share at roughly 60%. And now we've got an even more decadent segment growing of the female breadwinner. One sort of lens I've applied to that sort of sociological lens is that the first zone, the green zone, the corporate family zone is pre-modernity in a certain sense. That's baptized patriarchy. The yellow zone, male breadwinner, is modernity, which is every man an individual cog in the machine. And then the blue and orange zones are post-modernity, which is further atomized still. Now, the point I think you raised about wives and mothers there, I think is so crucial because, as I say, we've often had this dichotomy between sort of 50s male breadwinner models and then feminist arguments. And I think that the corporate family, the domestic economy, resolves this dialectic in tangible ways where families actually benefit from the gifts and differences between men and women.
Absolutely.
When the wife is part of the family economy, she naturally fulfills her role as the submissive spouse. And this is something that Solange Hertz, the Catholic author, mentions, how the woman's desire is for her husband. And so she wants to be part of his world. And there was something very estranging and almost traumatizing for women when the male breadwinner model became so prominent and she could no longer use and give her gifts of affectivity and creativity, particularly, and femininity, to her husband in his work. And so now the modern economy directs that feminine submissive instinct towards big daddy government or big daddy corporation, which again is unhealthy for families.
Yeah. So, right. So you have the wives who, instead of becoming helpmeets to their husbands, they're helpmeets to their bosses. But it's just a transference of loyalties, essentially. I think, and you hit on this, that's a really good setup for those different stages of employment and how that worked about. If you're taking 1950 as your baseline for where, we want to get society back to, and I know there are people that think that was the golden day. You're way off. That was not it. 1950 was the culmination of many, many factors arriving, and it was a hollow solution, as we found out, because the entire thing crumbled apart within the next couple of decades. And so the feminists are starting to, if they're rebelling against what was happening in the 50s, the problem with all of these disputes over gender roles and those kinds of things, and Alan Carlson does a great job of writing about this, and I borrow from him. But all of these disputes are settled, as you said, when you're talking about a home economy, a home-based economy, where if you work where you live, essentially, all of the roles are all necessary and they're complementary naturally, the closer you are to the natural environment. And there doesn't need to be a dispute about women's pay versus men's pay or things like
right.
This. There doesn't need to be competition for dominance in their own household, as one of the famous feminist authors concluded. So you're working together, you're yoked together. The Bible portrays a picture of a husband and wife as being one flesh. And I would extend that to the children as well, is that they are joined together under covenant in God's eyes. And that whole family has a mission together. It's not so that they have an individual boarding pass to heaven, for example, and they just travel along on the same train. No, they've actually received a vision together as a family led by their father, who I believe is responsible for obtaining that vision from the Lord, helping to execute and walk out that vision for his family. But together they walk that out. And that is the unit. That is the model that God ordained for work in the world. He did not send Adam out on his own to do one job and Eve out to do her job. Adam needed Eve and Eve needed Adam. And then they both had their own progeny, and that became part of the family line as well. So I think that's a critical understanding, is you have to step further back, as usually is the case, to understand dilemmas that we're in today. You have to go back quite a bit further than you think initially. And once you start uncovering these threads, you'll find out that it wasn't even in the 20th century. It was really in the 17th century, the 18th century, where we started to see the crumbling of these understandings of what families were for and what their functions was.
There's not an argument about female work or male and female roles. It's very clear for the baker and his family. Of course, he's going to do the heavy work and she might do the more aesthetic design work or whatever, but it's collaborative and it's natural and it's organic.
Yeah, I think what you're touching on is one of the great challenges in the modern age is the rise of individualism, is the mentality as kind of the fulcrum of all society rests on either the liberation or the satisfaction or the prosperity of the individual. And if you take a view of life that puts the individual at the center of all things versus, say, the family, or let me say it this way, the individual as the basic economic unit of society versus the family as the basic economic unit of society, you come out to a very different outcome. You come out to, the outcome we have now, which is all able-bodied adults working full-time in a productive capacity, where the children and the elderly are relegated to institutional care, at the supervision of strangers, and nobody, even siblings, in public education, for example, even siblings are separated into age segregated classrooms. So everything becomes isolated down, and it really tears apart the fabric of the family. And that's for those who actually care about their families. If you care about your family, and you're not interested in just the satisfaction of personal ambition and lust, then you're going to be asking yourself, as I did, and as many folks have been doing, there's got to be another way to do this. What is there a viable alternative for families today who want to work together, who want to stay together, live together, who don't want to be fragmented into every separate state and corporate institution that's available? And you can extend that beyond families into communities. Is there a way for communities to work together? Well, yeah, but it starts with the families. You've got to have families who are integrated and whole before you can have communities that can thrive together. And so, we moved from a period where this wasn't really even a conversation, because the household was all there was. There was no corporation. If you were going to survive at all, you had to be a productive member of your household. You had to contribute to the whole, and you had to work together. For thousands of years, that's how society worked. And then they depended on the church, and they depended on the local community and their neighbors. And that was the basis of society. We're talking 5,000 plus years. This is how we did it. It's really only in the last couple of 100 years where we have these abstractions, these technologies that allow us to abstract from the natural environment, to really buffer ourselves from harsh realities, let's say. And so anything that becomes undesirable, we create a technology or we automate it And so that we don't have to deal with digging in the dirt anymore. We don't have to deal with raising animals. We can have somebody else do it for us. Joel Salatin, fairly well-known American farmer and author, and does just about everything. He says some people are still under the delusion that it's somebody else's job to raise the food until I'm ready to eat it. And that's the whole, kind of gets at the heart of the matter, is we're all responsible to creation. We're all responsible to our families, to provide by the work of our own hands, Paul says in Thessalonians 4, right? Work with your own hands and be dependent on no one, is what he says. So it just turns out that as we abstract ourselves for individual personal fulfillment, we end up necessarily pushing away these relationships that are the very things that make life meaningful. And that they're the very reason why faith is passed on generation by generation, which is another thing I mentioned too, is that the breakdown of faith in the last 100 years alone is unlike any kind of apostasy we've ever seen in world history. But it's really a walking out of this intergenerational relationships that have been fractured to a degree that people can no longer do the basic functions themselves, not even passing on the faith to their own children. We see this across the board, across all denominations and faiths.
Yes, well, the there about how shared work for a family should be the basis of productive domestic economies and healthy families and healthy communities. It used to be that you couldn't tear a man away from his craft, that it was a labor of love, and that work, although of course a man works by the sweat of his brow and he has to struggle against thorns and weeds, it is sanctifying, and it is something that is actually deeply satisfying as well. And now that most people work in mind-numbing jobs, prioritize these abstractions, filling in spreadsheets, navigating bureaucracies, working through media rather than working with human beings. No wonder they dread the Monday morning commute and the onset of the working week. In my own line of work, I have a lot of interaction with young adults, with what are called teenagers. Adolescents, a kind of 20th century invention. Because prior to that, the young adults worked with their family businesses and their family economies. And I see young adults with far too much time on their hands and basically falling prey to the temptations of lethargy and indolence, and then just plugging into technology, because there is no way for them to help with their father's job in banking or their mother's paralegal job or something that takes place in an office, and the home becomes this kind of dormitory where the family, or this hotel where the family just sleep and eat their meals. Whereas, it used to be the son was in the workshop helping his father and delighting in doing so, and the daughter was helping her mother making lovely goods in the kitchen.
Oh, absolutely. And I could camp out on that point about children's work ethic right now. It becomes evident, in a farm, you don't have to farm to have a family economy, but I like farming because there's so many opportunities for children to be involved from a very young age. And one of the most significant things that you can do for a young person is to give them meaningful work. If a child is contributing meaningfully to the family economy, that does so much for his self-worth. He knows when he's needed. And I can tell you what, our children are needed. We have 6 kids. Actually, you can update the bio from the book. We have 6 kids. Our youngest was born last year. Every single one of them has a role. And we appreciate every single one of them and need all of them in order to do the things that we're doing together. But at the same time, there's nowhere they'd rather be. They absolutely love being taking part in what I'm doing. We have sheep that we raise, and my oldest son is 12 now, but he's been, for the last 2 years, he's essentially taken over the shepherding side of the farm in terms of going out and feeding the animals in the morning, tending to all their needs.
It's a very prominent trade in your book.
It is. And he loves it. He came in yesterday actually and told me, Dad, I want to do woodworking and I want to raise sheep. I love sheep. So he's 12 right now, and he's already got a good grasp on some options for him later in life. And I, as a parent, have some clues now that our kids have tried out a lot of different things. I have some clues on where to help him and to find him mentors for. And I, as a parent, have some clues now that our kids have tried out a lot of different things. I have some clues on where to help him and to find him mentors for areas that maybe I don't have expertise in. But I'll tell you what, it's a very rich life and it's a very satisfying life. We don't have a screen other than our laptops. We don't have any televisions. The kids don't have iPads. We don't do video games. We don't do any of that stuff. Our kids are enjoying life too much with their own siblings to care about that kind of stuff. Instead, they read, they do their schoolwork, and then they work on the farm. And the same thing would go for adults, I would say. If you find yourself in one of those mind-numbing jobs, it is devastating to your morale. I remember I worked, decades in those mind-numbing jobs. And on good days, I could enjoy what I was doing, but I really wasn't getting the kind of fulfillment or meaning out of the work and the salary that a life should provide. It wasn't until we started to click together as a family to find a shared work, that's when it became much more meaningful. So I'm not saying that, there's anything inherently wrong with taking a job to put food on the table. I'm just saying there's so much more, and that God created us to do so much more than what you described, having our homes be overnight parking places. There's much more value and investment than what is in the paycheck.
I don't know if you ever heard of a book. It's got a rather vulgar title, so I won't give the full titles. Basically, BS Jobs by David Graeber.
I haven't.
He was an English author, I think. The idea there of the family as, in a certain sense, the extension of the father's personality in his role as servant leader of that family. And I think if you look historically, this is why we have, particularly in Europe, the great artisan traditions that are passed through families from father to son, particularly. And I'm reminded of a famous French story of in the time of Louis XIV. And there was a woodcutter called the Maître Pinot. And he was the oldest and most renowned woodcutter in France. And his family had been involved in forestry and woodcutting for centuries, going all the way back to the time of Charlemagne. And they could demonstrate that lineage. They'd been involved in the king's forestry work in Rambouillet and Versailles. And every year the king sent a picket of cavalry to bring him a scarf of honor. And he would attend the assemblies of the woodcutters of France as the great patriarch of the woodcutters. And at one point, King Louis XIV, acknowledging this great heritage and ancestry, offered to ennoble him, to make him a baron, to elevate him to the nobility of France, to the second estate. And Maître Pinot actually declined that offer of ennoblement. He said, I'd rather be the oldest of the woodcutters than the youngest of the nobles. Thank you very much. And I think there's a sense of the fact that there were dynasties of watchmakers, dynasties of artists, dynasties of illuminators, and that everyone has their station in life. And that actually bringing Christian perfection to your station is what results in the great cultural fruits that we've known in the ages of faith. If you look at somewhere like Mittenwald in Bavaria, which produces some of the best violins in the world, that is a result of cumulative excellence, fathers to sons passing down that craft. And so they don't have this idea of social mobility and they've got to grasp something more. Actually, they just receive what they inherit and they perfect it generation by generation. And that actually our station in life may be a very humble station and we've just got to stay there, and that's fine. And that's how you end up with the shoemakers of Northampton, the winemakers of Burgundy, the ceramicists of Portugal, the perfumiers of Provence, all these storied artisans who are the finest in the world.
Yeah, so you've got a much richer tradition than we do over here across the pond on that.
Well, bourbon makers of
Oh, there you go,
in Tennessee.
Louisiana. Yeah, so yeah, I agree. Well said. Well said. The perfection of craft